What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's talk about the best decks in Marvel Snap. This is the stock version of Arishem, the one you should expect to see. Most decks are running something similar to this in the Arishem space. There are, of course, some flex spots, and we will be talking about an alternate build of Arishem so you can understand what the main things driving this deck are. The three cards you'll want to pay a ton of attention to in a deck like this are Loki, Dr. Octopus, and Leech. Those are the cards that most of the snaps in this deck are predicated on. A turn 3 Loki, God forbid after a turn 2 Agent Coulson, a turn 4 Doc Ock, a turn 4 Leech. That's really what this deck is sort of built around right now. And a lot of that power, in my opinion, actually comes from Doc and Leech. A lot of people are going to be asking, why is Doc so strong right now? And the answer is because they nerfed Professor X. In most previous metagames, he was just worse than doing Professor X for a similar kind of result. However, Professor X being nerfed, you are now able to profitably play Dr. Octopus. You also have this extra energy from Arishem, making a card that was designed to be played on turn 5, and you have to sacrifice tempo if you want to do it earlier, into a card that you sacrifice absolutely no tempo for thanks to Arishem, and is immensely disruptive to your opponents, and you are then able to play it on turn 4, giving you 2 extra turns to clean it up. Many people ask why this wasn't a big thing with Electro, and I think that should be fairly apparent. Arishem is a deck that can play for early tempo by just playing cards with an energy ahead, and Electro is 2 power on turn 3, in addition to restricting your extra power. Your extra plays, I should say. And that is an issue because you need to play multiple cards to clean up the Doc Ock lane. These 5 drops, Dr. Octopus and Leech, are major issues for anyone who's really looking to combat this deck because they are so disruptive to game plans that are trying to beat it. They are the major hurdles you have to overcome. There are a few decks that I think are pretty good at doing this, and a lot of them involve running cards like Jeff and Nocturne and making those Dr. Octopuses less game-winning. In addition, Arishem is just a good points deck. And because it's a good points deck, it can make these sacrifices, like playing a Dr. Octopus, like playing a Leech, in order to get the disruption it needs alongside its points package. One of the most classic ways to win a game of Marvel Snap is points and disruption, and while Arishem might not look like it, that's actually what's happening here. Between the Doc, the Leech, the infinitely large number of tech cards, the extra energy, you're just always putting out good points and being able to deal with what your opponent is bringing to bear against you. I am interested to see if this deck is at all able to adapt to Cassandra Nova coming out in Deadpool's Diner next week. That will be a real test for a deck that starts with 24 cards in it. I just wanted to highlight this other build of Arishem that is going around that I actually think is pretty clever, if not necessarily the exact best thing to be doing. What you'll notice is happening here is that there is a Jeff in the deck, there is a Nocturne in the deck, there is a Vision in the deck. In case you can't tell, this is an Arishem deck that is built to be able to beat opposing Arishem Dr. Octopuses, with the theory being you can either play one of those cards into a lane, thereby making it undockable, or hopefully one of those cards will be pulled and make Doc not lock the lane up. This should give you an example that this is actually a vaguely successful thing to do of just how powerful and warping the turn 4 Dr. Octopus can be. It's a very strong thing to do, and turning it into a play that has a lot of explicit downside because that play is predicated on I'm going to Doc and then I'm going to win this lane later, and there's nothing they can do about it. Giving yourself something to do about it is actually quite powerful, hence all of the movers in here. One card I'm not very sure on here is Gwenpool. I think it probably should be Nick Fury. It's worth talking about why I'm a little bit higher on Nick Fury and Quinjet now than I was a few days ago, and I think that should be a little bit clear to people. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Mockingbird going to 6 has made Nick Fury notably better. Usually there's a couple of good generators that can really give you weird outs like Doctor Doom or Magneto, cards that people are not expecting. Now that it can also generate Mockingbird, we're talking a seriously powerful thing to happen. And I think that sort of swings me a little bit towards Nick Fury being good in here. It's possible I was wrong all along. Anyway, if you want to swap out Gwenpool for Nick Fury, feel free to do that in here. Thena Midrange is the only deck I honestly feel has the legs to compete with Arishem straight up, and I actually can feel favored in the matchup. And there are various builds of Thena midrange. We're going to cover all of them right now. I understand people are not going to be like super happy to see like Arishem, Thena, Thena, Thena. I get it, but that is sort of the way I have to structure this in order to make it intellectually honest. I think the two best decks in the game by far are some build of Arishem and some build of Thena. So let's talk about each of them and what the upsides are and what the downsides are. This build is a very, very straightforward deck. It looked at the nerf to Mockingbird and said, I would like to lean further in. And that means I'm including Gwenpool for my Mysterio, I'm including Sasquatch for my Mysterio, and now my Mysterio isn't just for Mockingbird, it's for much more than that as well. It has plenty of ability to cheat energy and all of the best cheapo cards in the entire game. Your early scalers go crazy, your late game reduce cost big guys go crazy, and of course you have Gwenpool Mysterio if you ever really need to get something done. This is a very solid list. It should be no surprise because this is the kind of deck, give or take, that was the best deck before Arishem came out, and now it is sort of reasserting itself as Arishem calms down as a legitimate, meaningful threat in this metagame. In a similar vein, we have Thena midrange featuring Ajax, Juggernaut, Hazmat, and Sage. Again, this is basically doing the same thing. One note here, though, is that this build is notably weaker to the card Leech than the other builds. That is something to keep in mind, because Sage gets hit by that, Juggernaut gets hit by that, Shang, you both have that, but it does get hit by that, and of course, Hazmat gets hit by that as well. So, for that reason, I have ended up trending towards the one that gets leeched a little bit less badly. Both of these decks have some counterplay to Dr. Octopus in the form of being Kitty, Jeff Nocturne decks. They are decks that have a lot of ability to not get totally blown out by Dr. Octopus, and I think that combined with their general power level and the way Arishem has trended allows me to feel fairly confident with both of them, but I do feel a little bit more bulletproof when I'm playing the one that doesn't get obliterated by Leech, because this one definitely can. Yes, there is yet another one of these to talk about. This is the one with the move package in it. I think it should be very clear that all that's happening here is people are quibbling over the details, and what we've established is that running Thena package and Jeff and Kitty Pryde and Nocturne and Shang-Chi, that's what really matters here. That's what this archetype really is. It's about that stuff, the way that matches up into Dr. Octopus, how good Shang-Chi is right now. That's what we're really covering here. If you want to play the move version, I think that's fine. I think the other two are better. I covered them in the order I think they are good right now, and that's totally acceptable if you disagree with that order. But what I'm really trying to talk about is the larger archetype here of this Thena mid-range movers anti-Doc Ock kind of configuration of a meta-defining deck. Anni Sersi is a perfectly acceptable and powerful mid-range deck right now. I know Butt climbed like 400 SP on this deck. I know Woody's been having success with it. This is a good deck. I feel fine playing it. I think that it is generally what I would describe as a cut below the previous two, though. The other two, I think, are meta-defining decks. This is a deck that can match up into them, but I think ultimately feels a little bit more like tier 1.5 than a true tier 1. Because of that, it ends up being a little bit less recommended, but it is not necessarily any less powerful. It just ends up being a little more telegraphed and a little more awkward. There's different things that happen in these matchups, right? You are a little bit weaker to Dr. Octopus than the other deck is. That's just how it goes, right? You are a little bit weaker to Leech than the other deck is. Again, that's just how it goes. You don't have a Shang-Chi the way the other deck does. Your interaction on the final turn is limited mostly to Shadow King. You are able to make all of this work, but I think it has become clear to me that the Thena Shang package is kind of what is optimal for mid-range decks right now, and so this deck is playing a little bit of catch-up. There's nothing wrong with it. I have a fine win rate with it in High Infinite, but I do think it ends up being just a little bit lower on the totem pole than the Thena-style mid-range decks in the context of this metagame. Ajax has been making some moves in Clog, which is a fairly obvious home for him because, again, this is a deck that is playing Dr. Octopus, you're clogging your opponent up, you're really trying to get a lot of cards on the board, it makes your Hazmat extremely, extremely powerful, makes your Ajax extremely, extremely large. I'm not sure either of them are necessarily required here, but it is worth noting that the Ajax build of this does have better stats on untapped than the previous builds of this deck, which were involving Dagger and Ghost Spider and things of that nature. Now, I'm not saying that's a 100% guarantee that Ajax is a required card in here, but it is notable to me. One thing that I do think you can do is if you're not feeling Cannonball, I think you can probably replace it with a Nebula or something like that and be mostly fine with the decision that's been made here. Replacing Ajax does actually get harder because, as far as I can tell, this actually does seem to be statistically a little bit of a better build than the alternative. You're going to have to figure out if having a slightly better Clog build is worth it for you, or if you're comfortable just playing the old Clog build with the Dagger Ghost Spider stuff and getting really into the nitty-gritty of being an elite, hard to play against Clog gamer. I think one person to look at who's done this very well is Husky Puppies, who's a great Ghost Spider Clog gamer, but I do think that if you asked me to choose which Clog build was the right one to do, I would say this one right now, followed by the Dagger version, followed by the Mill version, which I think is pretty clearly by far the least good. Bounce is a fairly powerful deck right now. You'll notice that the two main dominant decks, the Arishem deck and the Thena deck, are not particularly great at having their power allocation not be telegraphed. Like when there's a Thena somewhere, you know what it's going to be, you know they're investing in it, you know they're going out of their way to make that happen. You are able to reasonably match up, and usually with a bounce deck like this, you can say, I am going to beat two of these lanes. I get to pick and choose where my power is going, and they are a little more locked in, a little more static, a little more, they have a useless Shang-Chi in their deck, right? Like, this is a deck that thrives on power allocation. Bishop is huge, of course. Hitmonkey is huge. Sasquatch is huge. You have a lot of things that can go right for you in a deck like this that allow you to just outpower in two specific lanes the other two top decks, Arishem and Thena. Now, the way this usually ends up looking is there's one lane that both of you are really contesting heavily. You win that one, and then you win another lane that both of you aren't contesting as hard. That's typically how it ends up going. When you play this deck and it all comes together, the power is genuinely immense. You are going to have to keep an eye on potential Alliates out of Arishem, which can be very dangerous to your Hitmonkeys. Phoenix Force is just legit. I cannot tell you how many times I'm just straight up dead to Shuri into Nimrod. I cannot tell you how many times I'm just dead to that. It's so many times. I'm just instantly dead to Shuri into Nimrod. They don't even need to do the Phoenix Force stuff. I have lost to Snap Shuri Nimrod. It's not even all that hard to do because this is an amount of numbers. Like when you are getting a 12 power Nimrod and then you are doing boom, boom, you're putting 24 power in basically every lane as long as one of those cards is Venom. It's just an extremely, extremely strong thing to do. And yes, you know, it's possible that you can get got. There are decks playing Shadow King. There are very few decks playing Cosmo, but they do exist. And I think that like this sort of kind of deck that just sort of operates totally differently than anything else is able to succeed right now. Like it is quite strong. And especially if you're looking to target the Thena decks, the Sersi decks, a lot of them just aren't going to be prepared for this in a meaningful way. Destroy remains a deck that you can play, and I won't feel too bad about it, but like this is a deck that I think everyone sort of gets the gist of at this point. You have your one flex spot. I have a Shang-Chi in there. It could be Lady Deathstrike. It could be Arnim Zola. Whatever you want to do. The basic thing you're really looking for, though, is you kind of need your Deadpool high rolls in this game. The high roll of this deck genuinely is competitive with anything, but it does require a lot. Because you don't just want to be a Deadpool deck, you want to be a Deadpool plus null on 6 deck, which means you also need X23, and you also need to be drawing all the stuff that lets all your other stuff go boom. This means in turn that your best draws almost always involve Nico Minoru and the ability to draw 2 cards off of her because of the way that makes your deck go. When you are doing your final turn big Deadpool and null, you are actually still mostly unbeatable. It is actually going to get to the numbers you need to get to. When you are not, though, you end up a very predictable, very easy to deal with deck. And especially as more decks are running Mobius right now, the fact that you are often unable to even do Deadpool and Death is a very big problem that this deck runs into. This is sort of why there's a Shang-Chi there. And so you have something that can swing a lane that isn't just Null or Death, because they're often not getting down. And so you end up pairing Shang-Chi with Deadpool or something like that. And that's sort of indicative of the issue here. There's just enough small things working against this deck that it needs to super high roll. And when it does, it's very good, but it doesn't do that enough. Namora as an archetype is around. You can play it. It is a deck. It has reasonable threat. There is not a lot of Cosmo going on right now. There are, in theory, a lot of things going in favor of Namora because of the amount of power it can bring to bear. This is still a deck that can really combo off, fill up the entire board with Tigers, and or once your opponent is afraid that you're going to fill up the entire board with Tigers, swap to being a Sage on long lane deck and just dominate that one lane. There's a lot going for a deck like this. I do think that this is a deck, to me, that as much as it might not seem like it, is actually sort of gated by the appearance of Sage if your opponents know you don't have it. If your opponents don't know you don't have Sage, then they might be forced to play around it. If they do know you don't have Sage, then you're running into some issues, because when you are just Odining, your output is extremely predictable. And so if you don't have access to that mix-up with the Sage on that long lane, a lot of the time what's going to happen is your opponent is going to be like, okay, well, they're playing Odin here. Either I leave for however many cubes are on the stack, or I stay and win double that. And they will know exactly what's going on. And so having the threat of that mix-up, I do feel, is quite important. Loki is in a pretty sad state. As an Arishem counter, it sort of dropped off once Arishem stopped running the stuff that countered itself, and now it just ends up in this weird interregnum where, not interregnum, this weird interim stage where this is not the best way to play Loki. Unfortunately, that's just in Arishem right now. And it's not good enough into the Arishem deck that you feel good about it. It's not good enough into the Thena decks that you feel good about it. Partly because of Thena, and partly because of the other discounters that you have, and partly because those decks sometimes run Mobius, right? There's a lot going on that makes this deck awkward. It's playable, don't get me wrong. You can do it, but I do think that right now you just end up feeling very weird about it. I do still like running the Darkhawk here because of you being a Loki deck. Loki has always been more able to just like run a random card that wins a random matchup, and then, oh, we're not in that matchup, it's fine, I'll Loki it out of there some of the time, right? And that is perfectly acceptable to me. I think of the decks on this tier list, it's the one that I'm most okay with someone just being like, yeah, I'll run a random Darkhawk in here, it'll be fine, we'll make it happen, right? That's, the issue is, you can win one lane against Arishem with a Darkhawk, but it kind of has to be on turn 6, because otherwise they're going to blow it up, or steal it, or whatever it is. And if you don't do that, then how are you winning another lane? It's sort of the issue that this deck has right now. It's a little bit awkward. It really, really is. I see a lot of people still complaining about Loki, and I do not think that this archetype is the problem. It's a very good card in Arishem, but it's like maybe top 3 rather than top 1 in the deck. I don't know. WolfJax was used to great effectiveness by Big Baby and by Gnome, both of whom had some pretty solid games with this deck in High Infinite, enough that I trust it. It currently has like about a 52% win rate, this specific build, in top 10% Infinite, which is normally a bit on the borderline for a deck I'm putting on the tier list, but the fact that so many of my friends have been doing so well with it, and the fact that it's just incredibly hard to play, does give me pause. This is a very borderline deck, but if you're looking for something interesting, if you're looking for something weird, if you're looking for something off the wall, this is actually genuinely powerful. I think the real question for me, though, is whether it ends up being stronger than the baseline bounce deck. Right now, I don't necessarily think that it is, but it does have the advantage of just being weird. And when you are a weird deck, your opponent is not going to play around things in a way that is always correct. However, that advantage is mitigated a little bit in Bounce, because Bounce is already a deck that throws priority such that counterplay doesn't really exist all that much anymore. There's already so much ambiguity on turn 6 that adding the ambiguity of I don't know what they're going to be doing almost has diminishing returns, because bounce is already just like, oh god, what lane are they going in? How many points are in each of these lanes? What am I realistically doing about this? There's already so many things for people to think about that adding on like something like this, it has a bit of a diminishing return being weird in a bounce deck than it does in a like more straightforward, less guessy kind of final turn deck. One of my friends has been holding around top 200 with Pool 2 Arishem, and I just wanted to point that out. Like, I don't necessarily recommend anyone buy this, but the fact that this is like a deck you can reasonably look at and be like, you know what, that ain't that bad, monstrous. Arishem is by far the absolute best card to buy if you are on a budget right now. It is so completely insane. And I don't know if that's going to remain true after Cassandra Nova. I truly hope that it doesn't. But the fact that this is a deck that can compete at the highest levels of the metagame, not necessarily like be the best deck, but this is you can compete. Every single card in here other than Arishem is in Pool 2. All of them. That's nuts. That's just bonkers. It is a crazy thing. This is like maybe 2 Series 5 cards away from being like the actual metagame deck. That is a ridiculous thing. That is an absurdity, an absolute absurdity that this exists. And I do think that it should give some people pause when they talk about how it's actually Loki's fault or whatever. It's not. It's Arishem, guys. This is the card that does the thing. This is the card. That's the problem. Yo Woody hit rank 1 with MoonJax. I'm a big fan of the naming. I like it makes me feel like I'm trying to accomplish something great, and this deck is definitely trying to accomplish something great. Think of it like a bounce deck or, you know, like any of the old She-Hulk double up decks. Issues it runs into are definitely things like Mobius and Mobius into your Quinjet. It is built such that you don't have to be a deck like that. Like, I like that it is also able to just be a normal deck that does normal things, that puts out power in a normal way, that disrupts your opponents in normal ways. One thing to keep an eye on here is the Viper Mysterio stuff alongside Yellow Jacket. I just think that's cute. That's a real slick thing to do. There's a real Clog sub-theme here that I think is important to understanding what this deck is doing in non-Moon Girl games, because this Clog plus Hazmat plus Ajax, like your ideal game can just kind of look like a Clog game where you clog them up, you Hazmat, you Ajax, and they're just dead. You send over too much stuff, and that is fine. You can do stuff like this. You're also just very liable to put a bunch of points down on the final turn of the game. Solid deck. You can play Mr. Negative if you want to. If you do, I think the best build is still Duboss's build from a couple weeks ago that was very metagame toward being Arishem specific, because you kind of do want to be Arishem specific. It is still probably the most common deck you're going to run into. And because of that, you end up feeling like, all right, you know, I got to be this kind of deck. You have a ton of power, though. Like, don't get me wrong. You are still going to try to beat most decks when you are able to pull off your Mr. Negative stuff. That's still going to happen. So because of that, you are less forced to be an anti-Arishem deck and more able to be an anti-Arishem deck because your matchup spread already sort of covers everything else just by virtue of having, like, flipped Iron Man or whatever. That'll be able to outpower most Thena lanes pretty handily. And then you have, you know, like a flip Zola, all this stuff. It's like you kind of get to free roll the normal matchups and skimp on them a little bit so that you can absolutely try to dominate an Arishem one. You can play Zoo. I'm not sure I would recommend it. I think this is a deck that just a lot of people have gone very far away from, and I don't blame them because this is a deck that has a lot of problems with getting clogged, and there are some very powerful cards that are really trying to clog you right now. There are multiple Doc Ock decks on this tier list. It turns out, when you nerf Professor X, everyone just goes and plays budget Professor X, and that also beats you because you are a deck that is super vulnerable to getting clogged up. You have limited board space and a lot of cards that fill it, and you end up in these awkward, awful scenarios where they've just like guaranteed won a lane, and then they like pulled your Squirrel Girl and your Shauna, and you absolutely lose the game. It's hard for me to think of a deck that is worse into Dr. Octopus than Zoo, and that is just bad. That's just a bad place to be. There might be one deck that is worse into Dr. Octopus than Zoo. I think that Dracula Dump has sort of not necessarily aged out of being a relevant Arishem counter. It was a little bit before they were Doc Leech decks, right? Now it ends up in a little bit more of a precarious spot, because your Dracula, like, they might just pull all the stuff you wanted to hit with your Dracula into a lane on the Doc Ock, and then Shang-Chi that lane, and your Dracula doesn't do anything. Like, it's not always happening. It's not, you can still play the deck. But I do think that if you had to choose a deck on this tier list that is like the most borderline, this might be it. I think there are several decks here where it's like, if you made me choose between Pool 2 Arishem and this, I would probably choose Pool 2 Arishem. And that's just like, that is, can we talk about that for a second? That is so insane. Like, that is, it's a testament to like just how many good cards there are in Pool 2, actually. Because you have Shang, you have Enchantress, you have Leech, you have like a bunch of like really good cards. And you even get to play like some underrated gems like Storm. And like that's really good in Arishem if you ever draw it. Like there's some really good stuff going on in there. But like the second thing is Arishem is just crazy right now. Just a crazy card. And I think that the fact that there are like actual decks in here that are decks that I have played that I think are probably worse than Pool 2 Arishem is a horrifying, horrifying thought. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it to the end of that video. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you have any of those. I still read all the comments. People don't believe me. They keep leaving comments that are like, oh yeah, you still read all the comments? And I'll be like, yes, I do, because I read that comment, because I still do that. All right, thank you so much. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.